All right, so we're diving into Dom Casmurro this time. You guys have been asking us to unpack this one for a while, and I gotta say I'm already hooked.
Oh, it's one of those books that really stays with you. I
Oh,
mean, we have this memoir by Bentinho, right? Looking back on his life, just totally convinced that his childhood sweetheart Capitu betrayed him. But the way Machado de Assis writes it, you can't help but question everything Bentinho says. It's brilliant.
yeah, we're dealing with a classic unreliable narrator here right from the start, which always makes things a bit more interesting. To set the scene for our listeners, it's 19th century. Rio de Janeiro Bentinho grows up in this super sheltered religious household. His mother's got him on the fast track to priesthood, and then Capitu enters the picture.
And she is everything Bentinho is not.
Yeah.
She's bold and independent, and even as kids, their connection is intense. But here's where things start to get interesting. Even in those early chapters, Machado de Assis gives us these subtle hints about Bentinho's jealous nature.
Yeah, like there's that moment when young Capitu is totally captivated by stories of Julius Caesar.
Hmm.
Powerful men who command attention.
Exactly. It's almost like foreshadowing, right? From the very beginning, we see Bentinho's anxieties about losing Capitu to someone who embodies those qualities, someone more powerful, someone more assertive.
So off Bentinho goes to seminary.
Yeah.
You'd think that would be the end of it, right? Problem solved.
Right, out of sight, out of mind. But of course, it doesn't work that way. Bentinho's feelings for Capitu don't just magically disappear.
Nope. The seminary almost becomes like this battleground for him. This internal struggle between what society expects of him and what he actually desires. His religious duty versus this burning passion for Capitu.
Exactly. And you know what I find fascinating? It's like this whole experience actually fuels his insecurities. Think about it. He's essentially being told to suppress a fundamental part of himself, his love for Capitu. It's almost like setting him up for a lifetime of repressed desires and then ultimately projecting those repressed desires onto Capitu.
Oh, that's an interesting take. And then we can't forget about Escobar Bentinho's friend from seminary, who ends up marrying Capitu's best friend. Talk about a recipe for disaster. The way Machado de Assis positions Escobar. It's brilliant, dramatic irony.
Oh, absolutely. He's both Bentinho's confidant and eventually the man Bentinho believes stole Capitu's heart.
Exactly. With Escobar in the picture, it adds this whole other layer to this story. It's not just Bentinho and Capitu anymore. It's this complicated web of relationships. And it shows how easily perception can get skewed, especially when jealousy is involved.
Right. And then we jump forward. Bentinho and Capitu are married. They have their son Ezequiel. You'd think things would settle down a bit, right?
Yeah, you think so. But that's when Bentinho's suspicions really take root.
Right. This seemingly idyllic life they've built, their little castle, as Bentinho calls it starts to crumble from within, and it all begins with these subtle, almost insignificant observations.
Like what kinds of observations?
No. Well, for example, Bentinho starts to notice Ezequiel bearing a resemblance to Escobar, picking up his mannerisms. And you have to remember, this is 19th century Brazil. A woman's fidelity was paramount, especially within their social class. Even the slightest hint of impropriety could ruin a woman's reputation, and by extension, her husband's. So even these tiny perceived similarities between Ezequiel and Escobar, they send Bentinho spiraling.
So it became like a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more he obsesses over these imagined resemblances, the more he sees them everywhere.
Exactly. And he starts reinterpreting past events, looking for clues to confirm his suspicions. It's like he's actively searching for evidence to support this narrative he's already created in his mind.
Like that scene at the beach where Sancha impulsively grabs Escobar's hand, and then later Bentinho sees a similar gesture between Capitu and Escobar.
Right. It's tragic because you see how Bentinho's whole perception of Capitu shifts. In the beginning, he's completely mesmerized by her eyes of Resaca. Those deep, magnetic eyes that Machado de Assis describes as having the pull of the ocean. It's such a powerful image that speaks to Capitu's alluring nature, but it also hints at this underlying danger that Bentinho feels she represents. Then, as his jealousy grows, those same captivating eyes become evidence of her deceit. It's like he twists every interaction, every glance to fit this narrative he's constructed.
And then tragedy actually does strike.
Mm-hmm.
Escobar dies suddenly, and this is where things get even more complicated.
Right, because Femisu is devastated. She's lost a dear friend. But instead of offering comfort, Bentinho interprets her grief as proof of an affair. He sees her tears for a lost lover, not a lost friend.
It's so interesting how Machado de Assis doesn't give us any easy answers. He forces us, the readers, to confront these complex human emotions, and how easily those emotions can be manipulated by jealousy and paranoia. And the symbolism he uses throughout the novel, the eyes of Resaca, the castle of their marriage that ultimately crumbles, it's also carefully crafted.
It really adds to the richness and ambiguity of the story.
So in the end of part one, We're left with this question. Is Bentinho's jealousy justified? Or is he just an unreliable narrator blinded by his own insecurities? We'll have to delve a bit deeper into the rest of the novel to try and find some answers. Okay, so we've talked about Bentinho's descent into this jealousy and how it really colors his perception of Capitu. But let's dive into her character a bit more. Who is this woman with these incredibly powerful magnetic eyes?
Yeah, Capitu is such a fascinating character because we're only ever seeing her through Bentinho's eyes, right? He paints this picture of her as this really enigmatic figure, alluring but dangerous at the same time. And you have to remember, this is 19th century Brazil. A woman's reputation was everything.
Right, being labeled as a femme fatale was basically social suicide.
Exactly. And Bentinho definitely seems intent on portraying her that way, you know? He constantly emphasizes her intelligence, her independent spirit. He even uses her childhood fascination with figures like Caesar as evidence of her ambition and desire for power.
Right, like she's this scheming manipulator from day one.
Exactly. He takes these totally normal aspects of her personality and twists them into something sinister. And it's interesting to think about how those societal norms we talked about play a role in shaping his suspicions. A woman who didn't fit into that expected submissive demure role, she was automatically seen as a threat.
Yeah, that makes sense. So is it possible that Capitu was just a woman ahead of her time? Someone who didn't fit into that narrow box society had created for her?
I think that's a very valid interpretation, and I think Machado de Assis intentionally leaves that open to interpretation.
Yeah.
He doesn't come right out and condemn Capitu, he just presents Bentinho's version of events, and lets us, the readers, decide what we believe.
So to us to fill in the blanks.
Exactly. And remember, we see how Capitu reacts to Bentinho's growing paranoia. She tries to soothe him, to reassure him of her love.
She even encourages him to reconcile with his mother, right? Even though their relationship is pretty strained.
Exactly. And she's a devoted mother to Ezequiel. Think about how overjoyed she is when he's finally born. She clearly loves both Bentinho and their son. It's hard to reconcile this image of a loving wife and mother with the conniving, adulterous woman Bentinho tries to paint her as.
It really is. And yet Bentinho seems determined to only see what he wants to see. He fixates on these little gestures, like the way she looks at Escobar, or how Ezequiel supposedly mimics Escobar's mannerisms. It's like he's actively searching for proof to support his preconceived notions.
And let's not forget about that pivotal scene with the opera glasses.
Oh yeah, when Bentinho completely misinterprets a gesture Capitu makes while looking at Escobar.
Exactly. He sees it as this undeniable proof of her attraction to Escobar, but we have no idea what was actually going through her mind. It could have been a completely innocent, fleeting thought, or maybe she was just caught off guard, we don't know. But Bentinho immediately jumps to the worst possible conclusion.
It's a perfect example of how unreliable his narration is. He's constantly filling in the gaps, adding his own interpretations and assumptions to events. He even admits to embellishing certain details. It makes you question everything he tells us.
Right, and the fact that we never get to hear Capitu's side of the story, it just adds to the mystery. It's like we're only getting half the picture.
And that missing half could completely change our understanding of everything.
Exactly. Okay, so we've examined Bentinho's perspective and how it shapes his portrayal of Capitu. But there's another crucial character we need to talk about, Escobar.
Ah, Escobar. On the surface, he seems like a genuinely good guy.
Yeah.
Charming, intelligent, deeply religious. He even helps Bentinho leave the seminary, which ultimately allows Bentinho to be with Capitu.
Right. He's the one who sets the whole thing in motion.
But Bentinho sees him as this insidious rival, a threat to his happiness.
Of course. And it's interesting how Bentinho draws these parallels between himself and Escobar. You know, they share similar interests. They're both devoted to their wives. It's almost like Bentinho sees Escobar as a reflection of himself, but like a more confident, more successful version.
And maybe that's what makes Escobar so threatening to Bentinho. He represents everything Bentinho wishes he could be.
It's possible. And there are even these subtle hints throughout the novel that Escobar might not be as saintly as he appears, you know? He has a tendency to flirt with women, and there are moments where his actions seem a bit calculated.
But again, we're seeing all of this through Bentinho's eyes. Can we really trust his judgment? Is it possible that he's projecting his own insecurities and desires onto Escobar, just like he does with Capitu?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's a question Machado de Assis masterfully leaves unanswered. He gives us just enough to make us doubt, to wonder if maybe there was something more going on between Capitu and Escobar. But ultimately, he leaves it up to us to decide.
And that ambiguity is what makes Dom Casmurro such a captivating read. It's not just a simple love story or a tale of betrayal. It's this psychological thriller that forces us to question the nature of truth, memory, and perception.
It really makes you think.
We're left grappling with these questions. Was Capitu really unfaithful? Was Escobar truly a villain? Or was it all just a figment of Bentinho's warped imagination?
And I think that's what makes this novel so relevant even today. It speaks to the power of our own internal narratives, how easily our perceptions can be skewed by our own biases and experiences. And in a world where we're constantly bombarded with information, it's more important than ever to be critical thinkers, to question what we see and hear, to consider multiple perspectives.
Absolutely. So we've explored Capitu, the captivating enigma, and Escobar, the supposed rival. But there's one more piece to this puzzle that we need to examine: Bentinho himself. What are we to make of this man who guides us through this whole tangled tale? Let's unpack his complexities in the final part of our deep dive. Okay, so we spent a good amount of time trying to figure out Capitu and Escobar. But I think it's time we turn the spotlight on Bentinho himself. I mean, he is the one telling us this whole story, which makes him a pretty fascinating character in his own right.
Oh, absolutely. He's definitely more than just a jealous husband. You really get the sense that he's struggling with his own identity throughout the novel.
Yeah, and it's interesting how his childhood seems to set the stage for all of his insecurities later on. You know, this sheltered upbringing, being coddled by his mother, and then that whole promise to the priesthood. It's like he never had a chance to figure out who he was outside of those expectations.
Exactly. And then Capitu comes along, and she's everything Bentinho is not. She's independent, she's curious, she challenges his entire worldview, and while he's clearly drawn to that, it also completely shakes the foundation of everything he's ever known.
So it makes you wonder if maybe his obsession with her supposed infidelity is just a way of deflecting from his own internal struggles? Like maybe he just can't handle the fact that Capitu doesn't fit into this neat little box that he's created for her.
That's a really interesting point, and I think Machado de Assis kind of reinforces that idea with Bentinho's nickname Dom Casmurro, right? It means Lord Grumpy or Sourpuss, and it really captures this bitterness that seems to just define him.
Yeah, it's like his jealousy, this all-consuming suspicion, becomes his defining characteristic. It colors everything he sees and does, even his memories.
And remember, he even admits to filling in gaps, embellishing details, to fit this narrative he's created. It's like he's rewriting his own past to justify his pain and resentment, even if it means distorting the truth.
Like when he's looking at Escobar's portrait, and he's feeling all nostalgic, remembering all of his friend's good qualities. But then, almost immediately, he's back to seeing Escobar's features in Ezekiel, and suspecting this grand conspiracy. It's wild.
It really is. It's such a powerful illustration of his mental state. He's constantly going back and forth between idealizing and demonizing, never settling on a stable perception of anyone, not even himself.
So is it possible that this whole tragedy, this entire story, is just Bentinho's way of trying to make sense of a life that didn't quite live up to his expectations?
I think that's the real question at the heart of it all. And it's the genius of Machado de Assis. He leaves us with this really unsettling question. Is Bentinho a victim of betrayal, or is he the architect of his own misery?
And the answer probably lies somewhere in those murky waters of perception and self-deception. You know, Dom Casmurro really forces us to confront this uncomfortable truth that sometimes our greatest betrayals come not from others, but from ourselves.
It's such a powerful message, and so relevant even today. It's a reminder that we all have the power to choose how we see the world, and that clinging to suspicion and resentment can end up poisoning everything we hold dear. It's definitely a story that stays with you long after you finish reading it.
Well said. So to wrap things up, Dom Casmurro isn't just a love story or a tale of betrayal. It's a story about perception memory and the complexities of human nature. It's a story that challenges us to examine our own biases and confront the uncomfortable truths about ourselves. And on that note, we turn it back over to you, our listeners. What's your verdict? Do you believe Capitu? Or are you siding with Bentinho? Let us know. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Dom Casmurro. We'll catch you next time.